What do wives with the things that do not fit? That may be the quiet question beneath every age of discovery. Not only what we know, but what we choose to keep at the edge of the lamp, half lit, half denied. History is full of such moments. A light seen over a valley, a sound rising from the deep, a signal crossing unimaginable distance, a fire that leaves behind ash and no clear story. Again and again, people encounter something that resists the neat shelves of explanation, and just as often, the world learns to step around it. This is not a story about proof in the courtroom sense, nor about grand claims dressed as certainty. It is a story about the uneasy border between evidence and acceptance, about phenomena recorded, measured, photographed, argued over, and still left in a kind of cultural twilight, not fully embraced, not fully dismissed, suspended there like a note that continues to vibrate after the instrument has gone silent. We like to imagine science as a straight road, bright and rational, moving steadily forward. But in lived experience, knowledge rarely unfolds that way. It arrives through confusion, through stubborn witnesses, through data that seems out of place, through people who ask questions at the wrong time or in the wrong tone. Sometimes the obstacle is lack of evidence. Sometimes it is lack of language. And sometimes, perhaps most human of all, it is the discomfort of standing before a mystery that asks more of us than measurement alone. So we begin here, in that unsettled space, with 10 phenomena that have lingered in reports, recordings, and memory like weather that never quite passes. Maybe some will one day yield ordinary answers. Maybe others will remain mirrors for our limitations. Either way, they invite a humbling thought, that reality is often larger than our confidence, and that the unknown is not always empty. Sometimes it is simply waiting, patient as stone, for us to learn how to look. What if the first mystery was not a monument or a machine, but a moving light no one could hold in their hands? It began, as many enduring puzzles do, with people simply looking up. A rancher crossing open land at dusk, a traveler pausing along a dark highway, a family standing on a porch, watching the horizon breathe. In the distance, small lights appeared and disappeared over the landscape, sometimes steady as lanterns, sometimes drifting apart like thoughts no one could finish. They hovered where no road should have been, flared without warning, then slipped back into the dark as if the night had quietly taken them in again. Over time, the stories accumulated. Scientists came with instruments. Skeptics came with theories. Locals came with memory. Some suggested distant car headlights, bent strangely by temperature and terrain. Others pointed to gases, electrical effects, or the tricks human perception can play when the world is reduced to darkness and contrast. And yet the lights kept returning, never long enough to settle the debate, never clear enough to close it. What makes such a phenomenon linger is not only what is seen, but what it awakens. A landscape changes when mystery inhabits it. An empty road becomes a threshold. A familiar hill becomes a stage for something unnamed. The people who watch do not always want an extraordinary answer. Often, they simply want an honest one. But honesty can be difficult when nature itself seems to improvise. Perhaps that is why these lights endure in the human imagination. Not because they prove something otherworldly, but because they remind us how easily certainty fades at the edge of vision. In that brief distance between seeing and understanding, wonder still has room to live. How do you live with a sound that others cannot hear? For some people, the mystery arrives after midnight. The house is still. The street outside has gone empty. Then, somewhere beneath the silence, a low vibration begins. Not loud enough to be a noise in the ordinary sense, but steady enough to enter the body. It resembles a truck idling far away, or a generator hidden behind the walls of the world. Once noticed, it becomes hard to escape. Across towns and coastlines, in valleys and suburbs, people have described the same experience. A faint hum, most often indoors, most often at night, pressing at the edges of sleep. Many who hear it say it leaves them exhausted, irritable, and strangely isolated. Because the first wound is not the sound itself. It is the doubt that follows when neighbors hear nothing, doctors find no clear cause, and ordinary language begins to fail. And yet the phenomenon has not lived only in testimony. Investigators in several places have found unusual low-frequency signatures. Engineers, environmental officials, and independent researchers have all brushed against evidence that something physical may be involved. Perhaps it is industrial machinery carried across distance in unexpected ways. Perhaps electrical systems, seismic motion, or some interaction between environment and perception. Each explanation illuminates part of the landscape, but none has fully brought the experience into focus. What lingers is the human cost of ambiguity. We tend to trust what can be shared, measured, repeated in the company of others. But some realities announce themselves unevenly. They reach one person and not the next. They expose how fragile consensus can be, even in a world built on instruments and agreement. Maybe the hum matters not because it overturns science, but because it reveals a quieter truth. Suffering does not become less real simply because it is difficult to explain. Sometimes the hardest mysteries are the ones that make people feel alone inside their own lives. What if memory itself could become a kind of evidence, fragile and luminous, even when the body falls silent? There are moments in hospitals when time seems to loosen its grip. Machines breathe in rhythm. Fluorescent light settles over polished floors. A family waits in the narrow space between hope and resignation. And sometimes from that borderland, a person returns with a story that does not fit neatly into medicine's usual language. They speak of hovering above the bed, of hearing voices from impossible distances, of moving through darkness, toward a presence that felt less like an object than a welcome. These accounts have often been grouped under the term near-death experiences, a phrase that sounds clinical but carries extraordinary emotional weight. What people describe varies in detail, yet certain images repeat across cultures and decades. Peace replacing fear, a panoramic unfolding of memory, encounters with loved ones, a threshold that cannot be crossed without surrendering life itself. To many listeners, these stories suggest the soul. To many scientists, they suggest a brain under extreme stress, generating vivid states from chemistry, oxygen loss, and the strange resilience of consciousness under pressure. Neither response is entirely satisfying because the phenomenon lives at the crossroads of data and meaning. Researchers have documented patterns. Physicians have studied the timing of brain activity during crisis. Philosophers have asked whether consciousness is produced by the brain or merely filtered through it. But beyond theory lies something more intimate, the unmistakable seriousness with which experiencers speak. Whatever happened, it altered them. Many return less afraid of death, but also more sensitive to life, as though the ordinary world has become newly breakable and newly precious. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They do not offer proof of an afterlife, nor do they collapse easily into pathology. They ask a gentler, deeper question. When human beings stand at the threshold of extinction and come back speaking of light, what are we really hearing? A neurological event, a spiritual glimpse, or the mind's final effort to make meaning from the edge of the unknown? What if the earth remembers what we have forgotten and leaves small clues in places where no one expects to find them? Imagine a line of stone running across an empty plain. Not a wall, not a road, not quite a grave, just shape imposed on landscape with such patience that it survives the people who made it. From the air, more patterns emerge. Circles, angles, pathways, figures large enough to be mistaken for accidents, until the full design comes into view. On the ground, they are fragments. From above, they become intention. Across the world, ancient sites continue to trouble the neat stories we tell about the past. Some are vast alignments of stone or earthwork, whose purpose still slips through our vocabulary. Others suggest knowledge of season, distance, or geometry that feels unexpectedly sophisticated to modern eyes. Archaeology has illuminated much of this terrain, and rightly so. Ritual, astronomy, agriculture, social order, burial, memory, these are not trivial explanations. They are signs of cultures thinking deeply about time and belonging. But even so, certain places resist reduction. They feel as though they were built not only to function, but to provoke attention across centuries. That tension has often invited exaggeration. Grand claims rush in where patience grows thin, yet the more grounded view may be the more moving one. We do not need impossible technologies or vanished superpowers to feel astonishment. Human beings, given enough generations, enough need, enough vision shared around fires and under stars, are capable of extraordinary coordination. Mystery remains not because ancient people were less rational than we are, but because their inner worlds were organized around meanings we only partly recover. Standing before such structures, one feels a strange reversal. We tend to think of the past as silent and incomplete, while the present imagines itself fully awake. But sometimes it is the old stones that seem composed, and we who appear hurried and forgetful. The question they leave behind is not simply how they were made. It is what kind of attention, what kind of patience a civilization must possess to build something meant to outlast explanation itself. What if the ocean, which gave us our earliest maps of fear and wonder, is still speaking in a language we barely understand? Far from shore, where the sea loses its color and becomes an idea more than a place, sound behaves strangely. It travels farther than light. It bends, deepens, disappears, then returns transformed. For sailors and researchers alike, the ocean has long been a keeper of voices no one can easily trace. A sudden metallic pulse, a rising moan beneath the hull, a low, immense call captured by instruments and replayed in laboratories, where even experts pause before naming what they hear. Some of these recordings have entered scientific folklore. They arrived through hydrophones anchored in cold water, through naval systems built for caution rather than wonder, through patient hours of listening to what should have been only current and ice and distant engines. Instead, there are sounds that seem too vast for known animals, too organic for machinery, too singular to fit comfortably into existing categories. Later, many are linked to plausible causes: shifting ice, volcanic activity, the groan of pressure moving through the deep. Yet explanation does not erase their first effect. They remind us how quickly the familiar world becomes foreign once we descend beyond sight. The mystery is not that the ocean hides monsters in the old mythic sense. It is that depth itself changes the scale of our understanding. Most of the sea floor remains imperfectly mapped. Entire ecosystems rise and vanish in darkness beyond ordinary reach. Creatures appear that seem imagined until a camera finds them, drifting like fragments of another era. In such a realm, uncertainty is not failure. It is the natural condition of knowledge at the edge of access. Perhaps that is why these sounds stay with us. They do not merely suggest hidden things below. They expose how thin our confidence can be above them. We live on the skin of a planet whose largest wilderness lies out of view, carrying movements, voices, and histories older than our institutions. And when the deep sends up a signal we cannot immediately place, the real mystery may be this: how much of reality have we mistaken for silence simply because we did not yet know how to listen? What if the mystery was not hidden in a desert or buried beneath the sea, but standing in plain daylight beside a Florida road? In the humid light of South Florida, there is a place that feels less like architecture than persistence made visible. Towering blocks of coral stone stand arranged with deliberate grace. A gate of immense weight once turned so smoothly that a child could move it with one hand. Walls meet with a precision that seems to belong to another era, or perhaps to a patience most of us no longer possess. And at the center of it all is a simple fact that still unsettles explanation. Much of it was built by one man working largely alone. He was slight in build, an immigrant with modest tools, and an inward life that invited speculation. Over decades, he quarried, shaped, lifted, and placed stones weighing many tons. He worked mostly at night. Neighbors heard sounds, saw silhouettes, guessed at pulleys and leverage, but no one offered a complete answer. When engineers later examined the site, they could describe what should have been required: teams of workers, substantial machinery, careful measurements. Yet the structure itself remained as evidence that whatever method was used, it belonged to a mind unusually comfortable with weight, balance, and exactness. It is tempting to rush toward myth. Hidden formulas, forgotten principles, private mastery over forces others overlooked. But perhaps the deeper wonder lies elsewhere. Human skill often appears mysterious when it is joined to obsession. A person can spend years learning what the impatient eye assumes must be impossible. Stone, after all, yields not only to force, but to repetition, to geometry, to intimate knowledge of material. And still, something remains unresolved. Not only how those blocks were moved, but why someone would devote so much of a life to arranging silence into form. Maybe that is the true monument here, a landscape altered by devotion. A reminder that the line between genius and enigma is sometimes drawn only by whether the maker chose to explain himself, or simply let the work endure in his place. What if the most haunting messages in history were the ones that arrived with no clear sender at all? Long before our world filled with wireless signals and invisible networks, there was a different kind of listening. Operators sat beside their equipment in dim rooms, headphones pressed close, waiting through static for the clean pulse of human intention. In that age, radio was not background noise. It was atmosphere, frontier, and promise. A person could reach across oceans with a rhythm of dots and dashes, and in that fragile thread of sound, entire worlds felt newly connected. But now and then, something stranger ignored the line. Anomalous transmissions have appeared throughout the history of modern communication. Coded voices repeating for years, signals that seemed to drift without origin, fragments that sounded purposeful but resisted translation. Some were eventually understood as military systems, intelligence networks, or experiments wrapped in secrecy. Others remained oddly suspended between explanation and legend. Their power came not from what they conclusively proved, but from the feeling they left behind. That beneath the ordinary traffic of information, another layer of speech might exist, patient and unread. The imagination, of course, is quick to populate such silence. Hidden governments, lost expeditions, voices from beyond the known. Yet the more grounded reality may be just as moving. Every unexplained signal exposes a truth about modern life. Communication is never only technical, it is emotional. We hear intention in patterns. We feel presence in repetition. A human mind, confronted with a voice it cannot place, begins almost immediately to build a story around absence. That is why mysterious broadcasts continue to fascinate even after the equipment changes and the old frequencies fade. They remind us that technology has never erased loneliness. It has only given it new forms. To send a signal is to believe someone may answer. To receive one without understanding it is to confront the opposite possibility, that meaning can arrive intact and still remain beyond us. Perhaps every age has its version of this experience, a message in the dark, a pattern we recognize without deciphering, and the persistent hope that somewhere on the other end of uncertainty, another mind is trying to be heard. What if lightning, for a brief and impossible moment, decided not to strike, but to stay? Storms usually speak in verbs. They break, split, strike, vanish. But every so often, witnesses describe something that seems to resist that grammar entirely. A glowing sphere suspended in air, moving with slow intention through a field, a cockpit, a church, a kitchen. Sometimes it is no larger than an orange. Sometimes it swells to the size of a lantern. It drifts past windows, hovers over wet ground, slips through openings too small to explain, and then disappears as quietly as a held breath released. For centuries, such reports were pushed to the margins of respectable thought. Sailors, pilots, farmers, and scientists all described similar encounters, yet the phenomenon remained inconvenient, too rare to predict, too strange to fit the simple models taught in classrooms. And yet the consistency of the stories is difficult to ignore. The spheres are often luminous but contained, intensely energetic, yet oddly self-possessed. Some end in sharp explosions, others fade without heat or damage. A few seem almost aware of the spaces they enter, navigating rooms as if guided by rules we do not yet understand. Modern physics has not been entirely silent. Laboratory work has hinted that under unusual conditions, stable glowing plasma-like forms may briefly exist. Field observations have captured fragments of spectral data. Researchers have proposed silicon vapor, microwave interference, ionized air, chemical chains of reaction, all intelligent efforts to give language to what witnesses have long insisted they saw. But no single explanation has settled the matter. The phenomenon remains partly physical, partly elusive, occupying that uncomfortable region where observation arrives more readily than theory. Perhaps that is why ball lightning continues to feel larger than its size. It is not merely a curiosity of storms. It is a reminder that nature still contains behaviors we have glimpsed more often than we have understood. Even in an age of satellites and equations, the atmosphere can briefly assemble a form that looks less like weather than like thought made visible. And maybe that unsettles us for a simple reason. We prefer mystery at a distance, in ancient ruins, on the ocean floor, beyond the stars. But a sphere of light drifting across an ordinary room asks something harder. What if the unknown is not always far away? What if it has been visiting us in flashes, asking only that we admit how much of the world remains beautifully unfinished in our understanding? What if some mysteries endure not because they are impossible to solve, but because they arrive wrapped in longing? There are photographs that seem to hold more than an image. They hold atmosphere, an ache, the suggestion that something essential has stepped just beyond the frame. In the early years of photography, when exposure times were long and the medium still carried an almost ceremonial aura, people began producing portraits in which the dead appeared to linger beside the living, or the living seemed accompanied by pale, translucent forms no one remembered seeing in the room. A second face in the background, a hand resting where no hand should be, a figure made of mist and silver grain. To modernize, many of these images are easy to explain. Double exposures, plate defects, camera movement, darkroom accidents, and at times deliberate fraud. Photography was never a perfect witness. From its beginning, it was also a craft of illusion. Yet to stop there is to miss why such pictures mattered and why they still disturb us. They emerged in eras shaped by grief, by war, epidemic, infant mortality, sudden loss. For families living close to death, the camera did not merely preserve appearances. It became a fragile instrument of hope, a way to imagine that absence might still leave a trace. Scientists and skeptics did important work in exposing deception. They protected the grieving from people willing to profit from sorrow. But the persistence of these images says something deeper about human nature. We do not only want evidence, we want continuity. We want to believe that love leaves an imprint, that separation is not as total as it feels in the first stunned hours after loss. A blurred figure in a photograph may be an error of chemistry, but the need that animates it is unmistakably human. Perhaps that is the true subject of these images. Not ghosts in the theatrical sense, but memory itself, how it clings, distorts, revisits, asks to be seen. Every generation invents new technologies for keeping the absent close. Portraits, recordings, voicemail, cloud archives, old text messages that remain long after the sender is gone. The medium changes, the impulse does not. And so the photograph becomes a mirror. We look into it hoping to discover whether the dead remain with us and find instead a subtler truth. They do, though not always in forms the lens can prove. They remain in ritual, in recollection, in the architecture of our days. The mystery is not whether an image can capture a spirit, it is how love continues to shape the living, even after the visible body has vanished from the light. What if the strangest marks on earth were not messages to us at all, but traces of a conversation between time, matter, and chance? Sometimes the mystery is found not in the sky but underfoot. A stone split open, a slab lifted from a quarry, a fossilized imprint revealed in the patient work of excavation. There, pressed into rock older than language, appear forms that seem almost deliberate, circles nested in symmetry, grooves that resemble script, shapes that suggest footprints, tools, or patterns no one expected to find in that layer of time. For a moment, the mind rushes ahead. It wants the anomaly to become a revelation. This is one of the oldest tensions in science. Discovery begins with noticing what does not belong, yet progress depends on resisting the seduction of the first dramatic interpretation. Unusual geological formations, mineral staining, erosion, compression, the accidental artistry of pressure over millennia, all can produce images that look uncannily intentional. A natural process can leave behind something that feels designed, just as clouds can briefly resemble faces and riverbeds can imitate architecture from the air. Pattern is one of nature's gifts, but it is also one of perception's traps. Still, the recurring appearance of such anomalies has value. They force experts to look harder, test assumptions, revisit methods, and remain honest about uncertainty. In some cases, what first seemed impossible becomes a doorway to better understanding. In others, the wonder lies precisely in the correction, the realization that ordinary forces, given enough time, can create forms more elegant and surprising than fiction. The Earth is not static matter. It is an artist of pressure, heat, fracture, drift, and persistence. What these disputed objects reveal most clearly may be our own deep hunger for origin stories. We are drawn to evidence that history is stranger, older, more layered than the timelines we inherited, and sometimes it is. But just as often, what we encounter is not a hidden civilization waiting to be uncovered, but the humbling fact that reality is already more intricate than our categories can comfortably hold. Perhaps that is why such finds remain so compelling. They remind us that interpretation is never separate from desire. We look at stone and hope it will answer us in human terms. Yet the earth has its own grammar, one measured not in generations but in epochs. To study it well requires a rare kind of maturity, the ability to remain astonished even when the answer turns out to be natural, and to understand that natural has never meant simple. It only means we are still learning how vast the ordinary world really is. What if the final frontier was not outer space, but the fragile theater of the human mind itself? There are people who wake in the night unable to move, their bodies still locked in the machinery of sleep, while their awareness rises abruptly to the surface. The room is familiar, yet altered. Shadows seem heavier. Air becomes presence. A figure may appear at the edge of the bed, in the doorway, near the ceiling. Not always distinct, but unmistakably there. The experience can last seconds or minutes, though inside it, time loses its ordinary shape. Fear arrives first, then confusion, and only later the difficult task of explaining what felt more real than a dream. Across cultures and centuries, such episodes have gathered different names and meanings. Some traditions speak of spirits, visitors, or nocturnal oppression. Modern sleep science describes paralysis at the border of REM sleep, when vivid dream imagery can spill into waking consciousness while voluntary movement remains temporarily suspended. It is a persuasive framework, supported by physiology and repeated patterns. And yet the experience continues to trouble easy dismissal, because those who undergo it often describe not simply hallucination, but encounter almost a felt intelligence, a charged atmosphere, a terror so immediate it leaves a residue long after the body is free again. That tension matters. Scientific explanation can illuminate mechanism without erasing meaning. A brain caught between states may generate the sensed presence, the pressure on the chest, the visual form in the dark. But to the person living through it, the event is also emotional and existential. It exposes how little distance there may be between the mind that interprets reality and the mind that constructs it. In those suspended moments, consciousness becomes a threshold rather than a fixed place. Perhaps that is why sleep paralysis has remained so haunting in the modern age. It is at once deeply personal and quietly universal, private in its occurrence yet shared across geography and history. It reminds us that the unknown does not always come from outside. Sometimes it rises from within, from the layered architecture of the self, where biology and imagination are not enemies, but collaborators in the making of experience. And maybe that is the deeper reflection this phenomenon leaves behind. We spend much of life trusting our senses to draw a reliable map of the world. Then one night the body refuses motion. The room fills with presence and certainty fractures without warning. Whether we call it misfired dreaming or an encounter with something less nameable, the lesson is the same. The frontier between reality and perception is not a line far beyond us. It runs quietly through every human mind, waiting for those rare moments when the door slips open and we glimpse how mysterious consciousness has been all along. What if the strangest phenomenon on our list was not a place, a signal, or a storm, but the pattern that joins them all? By now, the landscape has become familiar. Lights on a horizon no one can fully account for, a hum that enters one life and spares the next. Stone arranged with improbable patience, voices in the static, fire that gathers into a sphere, images carrying grief like a second exposure, the sea speaking in tones too deep for ordinary certainty, the sleeping mind opening into terror and presence. Each mystery arrives in its own language, yet all of them seem to circle the same human experience, the encounter with something real enough to be felt, but not yet stable enough to be fully understood. It is tempting to sort the world into two simple rooms: what is known and what is fantasy. But most of human history has unfolded in the corridor between them. That is where observation begins. That is where science at its best learns humility. Not by believing everything, and not by scorning what resists easy explanation, but by staying with the question long enough for better tools, better language, and better patience to emerge. The unknown is not a failure state of knowledge. Often it is the condition that makes knowledge possible. And yet these phenomena matter for another reason. They reveal the emotional architecture of inquiry. We do not investigate only to dominate uncertainty. We investigate because mystery changes us. It slows us down. It reminds us that perception is partial, that memory is selective, that reality often exceeds the stories we are prepared to tell about it. In that sense, every unexplained event becomes a mirror. We peer into it hoping to discover the hidden structure of the world, and end up discovering the hidden structure of our own longing for order, for continuity, for meaning that can survive doubt. Perhaps that is why such mysteries endure even after some are solved. Explanation is important, but it does not cancel wonder. To learn that an eerie sound came from ice, pressure, or machinery is not to lose the mystery entirely. It is to exchange one kind of awe for another. The world remains astonishing, only now in a different register. And for the mysteries that still resist us, the unanswered space need not be filled with fear. It can also be filled with attention. So before we reach the end, one question remains. When future generations look back on our own era, with all its instruments and confidence, what will they see? A civilization that mistook uncertainty for weakness, or one that understood the unknown as an invitation? Not to invent easy myths, but to become more careful, more curious, and perhaps a little more humane in the face of what it could not yet explain. So where does that leave us? After the lights have faded, the recordings gone quiet, the stones return to silence, and the witnesses carried back into the ordinary flow of their lives. Perhaps here, with a gentler understanding of what mystery really is, not a contest between belief and disbelief, not a stage for spectacle, but a meeting point between human perception and a world that remains, even now, more spacious than our explanations. We have traveled through strange lights over empty land, voices hidden in radio static, radiant storms, uneasy nights, oceanic sounds, impossible architecture, and memories gathered at the threshold of death. Some of these may one day yield clean answers. Some may dissolve into error, folklore, or misunderstood data. And some may continue to hover in that unresolved middle distance where history often keeps its most revealing questions. Yet the lasting value of these phenomena may not depend on whether each one is solved. Their deeper gift is the posture they ask of us. They invite rigor without arrogance, imagination without surrender to fantasy. They remind us that skepticism is healthiest when it remains curious, and that wonder is strongest when it can live beside evidence rather than against it. In a time that often rewards instant certainty, there is something quietly radical about admitting that reality can exceed our current maps. This is, in the end, a story about human beings as much as unexplained events, about our need to listen, to test, to remember, to interpret, about the ache to feel that the world is still alive with unanswered things. We are meaning-making creatures standing on a planet older, stranger, and more intricate than any single generation can fully comprehend. And maybe maturity is not the disappearance of mystery, but the willingness to meet it with steadiness instead of fear. The future will bring new instruments, sharper models, and better language. Some doors will open, others will remain closed a while longer. But the unknown is not an empty void waiting to be conquered. It is part of the living horizon of knowledge, the place where humility and discovery walk side by side. And maybe that is the final insight worth carrying forward. We do not become wiser by eliminating every mystery. We become wiser by learning how to stand before what we cannot yet explain, and still choose patience, honesty, and wonder. In that choice, something essential is preserved, not only our search for truth, but our humanity itself.